Dear students, this is a new lecture on cultural studies. This has been titled as Linguistics and Cultural Studies, and in this lecture we'll be looking at how linguistic contributes or how linguistic contributed in the establishment of cultural studies as a discipline. Dear students, as we all know that cultural studies is a transdisciplinary academic field in which concepts and perspectives from different disciplines are selectively drawn. They have been re-articulated and re-theorized to examine the relations of culture and power. Students, the field, cultural studies, borrows, as we all know, freely from social sciences and also from humanities. I would now prefer to call it human sciences. In fact, very recently I was going through an article by Ferdinand de Saussure, or rather an essay or a research work by Saussure, and in which he said that there are two sciences actually, the human sciences and the natural sciences. So I was talking about that we all know that linguistics and cultural studies are very much interrelated. I was saying that we all know that cultural studies borrowed a lot of theories from various disciplines, and those theories were re-articulated and re-theorized in order to examine the relations with culture and power. Friends, this lecture is going to discuss the contribution of linguistics to the transdisciplinarity of cultural studies. We all know that cultural studies, when it took its initial shape, it borrowed a lot from structuralism, which is, a very strong and important part of linguistic studies. We will have another lecture specifically based on structuralism and cultural studies. But here in this lecture, we are talking about those linguists who played a very important role in the establishment of cultural studies. Friends, you know that a lot of linguists actually, a lot of theorists actually played a very important role in the establishment of cultural studies in its initial phase. But since this lecture is centered around the contribution of linguistics and cultural studies, so we'll be talking about the works of Ferdinand de Saussure, Claude Lévi-Strauss, Roland Barthes, and Stuart Hall. Stuart Hall because it was Stuart Hall who imbibed all those principles from structuralism, from linguistics, and then he involved all these aspects into a structural the structure of cultural studies. Friends, you know that these four names that I have taken right now are associated with 3-4 very specific fields. For example, when we think about Ferdinand de Saussure, he was associated with what you can say structural linguistics. When we talk about Claude Lévi-Strauss, he was more specifically associated with structuralism. When we think about Roland Barthes, He was certainly, you will agree with me that he was associated with semiology and the establishment of semiology as a very specific discipline. And of course, we all know about Stuart Hall, the one important ideologue who played a very important role in the establishment of cultural studies, or at least specifically the British cultural studies. So, friends, the fact of the matter is that this influence of linguistics on cultural studies began as a coincidence. Language was playing a very important theoretical role in the 20th century. In fact, a language was the greatest single force that had influenced 20th century thought, at least in the field of humanities and social sciences. And friends, this was the time when cultural studies was casting its innovative approaches towards culture in the 1960s and in the 1970s. So, more particularly, cultural studies crisscrossed the path of linguistics through structuralism. And we all know that structuralism was an intellectual movement that takes signification or meaning production to the effect of deep structures of language that are manifested in specific cultural phenomena on human speakers. So, friends, structuralism, as we all know, originated in France, Paris, France, in the 1960s, and it was first associated with the works of Claude Levi Strauss and Roland Barthes. We all know that structuralism as an intellectual movement was heavily influenced by the works of a number of linguists. And among all those linguists, the most profound influence on structuralism came from Ferdinand de Saussure, and this has been evidenced through the recurrence of various Saussurean terminologies in the works of early structuralist philosophers, early structuralist linguists, despite their different ideological orientations. So, friends, Saussure was actually that linguist who developed to the study of language through scientific methods. He was looking at the science of languages, looking at the study of languages in a very scientific way, you can say. So he criticized his predecessors and even his contemporaries also for failing to find a true science related to the study of language, by not recognizing language as a discipline in its own. And friends, Saussure recognizes language as a discipline, as a specific discipline in its own way, in its own right, you can say. So, Saussure discovered that language has two distinct levels, and he named these two distinct levels as lang, Langu, GUE, sorry, LANGUE, and parole. So these two distinct levels of language has been named as lang and parole by Saussure. If I try to define lang in one sentence, lang is the underlying rule of a language. It is general, it is common, the underlying rule of a language. Whereas parole is specific, it is particular. If I try to define it in one sentence, it will be that parole is the executive side of those rules. That how those rules of lang are executed. So that comes under the consideration of parole. So parole is the executive side of those rules. Parole is actually about the very act of speaking. So Saussure argued that Lang is not to be confused with human speech, that is language, Langage. And he says that no, Lang should not be confused with language, Langage. Lang is not to be confused with the human speech, the language, of which it is only a definite part. Lang, according to Saussure, is both the social product of the faculty of speech and also a collection of necessary conventions that have been adopted by a social body to permit individuals to exercise that faculty. Thus, Saussure managed to separate a system lying behind the act, and the act itself thereby separating the purely linguistic question from those which would introduce psychological or physiological or even sociological considerations. So he separated those psychological, physiological, and sociological considerations, and he talked about the purely linguistic question. Saussure applied to the basic unit of language, which is the linguistic sign, So Saussure applied to the basic unit of language his newly discovered principle of abstract rules, which is, long, and their corresponding physical manifestation, which is, parole. I repeat this, that Saussure applied to the basic unit of language his newly discovered principle of abstract rules, long, and their corresponding physical manifestation, that is parole. So he consequently conceived the linguistic sign as having two faces. The linguistic sign as having two faces, the signifier, and the signified. So two faces, the signifier and the signified. What is signifier? Let us discuss it in one sentence only. Signifier is the acoustic component or the sound that corresponds to the physical manifestation of the abstract rules. I repeat, signifier is the acoustic component or the sound that corresponds to the physical manifestation of the abstract rules, whereas the signified is a mental or conceptual component that corresponds to abstract rules. Signified is the mental or conceptual component that corresponds to abstract rules. So furthermore, he perceived the relation between the signifier and the signified as arbitrary. Saussure perceived the relation between the signifier and the signified as arbitrary. And that is why here comes the concept of language's arbitrariness. So it was Saussure who was perceiving the relation between the signifier and the signified as arbitrary. And he concluded, therefore, that signs are arbitrary, and by doing that, he challenged a widely held view of his time that meaning is referential. So this concept prevalent at that time, that meaning is referential, was what you can say, challenged by Ferdinand de Saussure, and he argued that meaning is structural. It can be structured, it can be created. Because it is arbitrary, hence it is structural, and it is relational. It is relational. So he argued that meaning is structural and relational. And he went further to explain what he meant by introducing another pair of concepts. And here he introduces another pair of concepts, namely syntagmatic relations and associative relations. Associative relations are also popularly known as paradigmatic relations. So, while explaining that meaning is arbitrary, the relation between the signifier and the signifier is arbitrary. While explaining that meaning is not referential, rather it is structural and relational, Saussure went on further and he to explain what he meant by introducing another point or another pair of concept, and that was called as syntagmatic relations and associative relations, that is paradigmatic relations. So syntagmatic relations refer to a linear combination of words inside a discourse. Syntagmatic relation refers to a linear combination of words inside a discourse, whereas the paradigmatic relations refer to a non-linear combination of words outside the discourse. A non-linear combination of words outside the discourse. For example, the words which together form a grammatically correct sentence are related syntagmatically. Words in a specific sentence that come together, and being put together they form a grammatically correct sentence, are said to be in syntagmatic relationships. So they are related syntagmatically. For example, John is eating macaroni. So in this sentence, John is eating macaroni, these four words put together grammatically, creating a structure of a sentence, are syntagmatically related. In a very linear way they are related to each other. However, the word macaroni, for example, has paradigmatic relationship with reference to pasta in a sentence like John is eating pasta. So here, John is eating macaroni is a separate sentence. John is eating pasta is a separate sentence. John is eating macaroni, the words used here are having a linear relation together, so they are in a syntagmatic relationship. John is eating pasta, the words used here are also in a linear relationship. They are syntagmatically related. But when we pick up pasta from second sentence and macaroni from the first sentence and try to look at their relationship, the non-linear relationship outside the structural sentence, as we said, is paradigmatic. So one thing is common between macaroni and pasta, and it relates, and these two words are related, and that one word is food. Food is common in both these words. So this shows the paradigmatic relation between pasta and macaroni, you can say. So Saussure was convinced that language was a system of signs, SIGNS. So he was convinced that language was a system of signs that expressed ideas, and therefore language was comparable to any other sign system. It was comparable to any other sign system. For example, the system of writing. For example, the system of rituals. For example, the system of military signals. So, except these, language was the most important of the systems. The rituals, military signals, writing. So, except these, language was the most important of these sign systems. So, consequently, Saussure proposed a science that studies the life of signs, S-I-G-N-S. Science, so language as a science that studies the life of signs within society, and he called it semiology. He called it semiology, taking the word from semion in Greek. So Saussure's theory of language has received criticism also from the linguists and also from the cultural theorists. For example, Clarke regards Saussure as a Confucianist who failed, according to Clarke, to embody his philosophy of language in a systematic analysis of particular linguistic system, thereby casting the philosophy itself to remain programmatic. Clarke contends that Saussure discovered nothing. Rather, he introduced an extremely confused program, as evidenced by the fact that Saussure is easily claimed as a forebearer by different schools of linguistics. So the different schools of linguistics claiming Saussure as the forebearer is, according to Clarke, is a proof that he was a Confucianist. He did nothing specific as such, and he basically simply and only presented a confused program. Some other cultural theorists have questioned Saussure's lack of interest in the text-context relationship in his study of signs, S-I-G-N-S. Clarke, for example, once again, finds misleading Saussure's mentalist argument. So, according to Clarke, the mentalist arguments of Saussure are misleading. So, Clarke finds misleading Saussure's mentalist argument that the sign is arbitrary, because Clarke thinks that from the psychological point of view, the sign is not necessarily arbitrary. Anyways, friends, let us move on to another critic who asserted semiotics, or who wanted to assert semiotics over semiology, and that critic was Tomaselli, Tomaselli. And this Tomaselli was basically trying to propound the theories of semiotics, and he was trying to establish semiotics versus semiology, which was propounded by Saussure. So, in an effort to assert semiotics above semiology, Tomaselli observes that Saussure's semiology eliminates the political, the economic, the social, and the historical processes out of which specific texts arise. Thereby, Tomaselli says that Saussure was weakening its capacity to address certain contextual issues which are critical to the production of meaning. Finally, even Hall was also somehow was a bit critical of Saussure. Hall summarizes the concerns of cultural theory over the Saussurean model of science systems by concluding that it fails to deal with the true social character of language, because it regards language as a closed system in which meaning could be studied and predicted scientifically. Despite the various criticisms, my dear friends, despite all these criticisms levied against the Saussurean theory of language and the structuralist approach, Saussure's work remains important to cultural studies. In what way? Let us see now. Saussure tasked himself to develop the science of human culture. I'm quoting Saussure himself, quote unquote Saussure, to develop the science of human culture based on a conception of cultural phenomena as objective systems of forms dissociated from the individual subject with their own immanent and specific laws imposing themselves on the individual with the force of the unconscious, unquote. So this is what Saussure was actually trying to do. Saussure further managed to show that meaning is socially constructed by arguing that any means of expression accepted in society rests in principle upon a collective habit or a collective convention. So, in the final analysis, Saussure's ideological program gave rise to the structural approach and its comparable theoretical approaches and caused many disciplines to consider the theoretical assumptions upon which their approach to their object of study was based, and indeed the constitution of that object. So the first influence, and from here we are now moving on to another linguist, a linguist on whom we see the most important and a very prominent, you can say, if not the most, a very prominent impact, Claude Levi-Strauss. So the first influence of the work of Saussure on cultural studies through structuralism is evident in the works of Claude Levi-Strauss. And this Claude Levi-Strauss, my dear friends, can be or has been seen as a pioneer of structuralism. Levi-Strauss was first introduced to structural linguistics by Roma Jacobson. It was at the New School for Social Research in New York, specifically in the year 1939, at the New School for Social Research in New York, Levi-Strauss was introduced to structural linguistics by Roma Jacobson. Jacobson at that time was empirically studying language impairment and loss among aphasics, APHASICS. So at that time, in the year around 1939, when Claude Levi-Strauss, with the help of Roma Jacobson, was introduced to structural linguistics, it was the time, my dear friends, when Jacobson was empirically making a study about language impairment and loss among aphasics. So Roma Jacobson found a horizontal vertical polarity in linguistic performance, which in his view supported Saussure's insight concerning the syntagmatic and paradigmatic planes of linguistics. So the discovery motivated Levi-Strauss to regard Saussure's study of language as a self-sufficient system that postulates a dynamic relationship between the components of every linguistic sign. Being convinced, Claude Levi-Strauss, being convinced that structuralism supported his view that culture and language existed inside the individual. Culture and language existed inside the individual. So being convinced of this, that culture and language existed inside the individual, Levi-Strauss advocated a marriage between principles of structural linguistics and anthropology. He was basically talking about a marriage between the principles of structural linguistics and anthropology. Levi-Strauss justified the proposed marriage between structural linguistics and anthropology. He justified this marriage on four grounds. Namely, number one, a structural linguistics shift from the study of conscious linguistic phenomena, that is parole, to the study of their unconscious infrastructure, that is land. Number two, its tendency to treat terms on the basis of their analytical relations rather than an independent entries. Number three, its concern of linguistic phenomena as part of a broader system. And number four, its aim to discover general laws either by induction or by logical deduction, thereby giving them absolute character. So, on the ground of these four points, Claude Lévi-Strauss was talking about a sort of a mixing or a sort of a marriage of structural linguistics and anthropology. So, in order to address the skepticism of both linguists and anthropologists, Lévi-Strauss wrote an essay. And Lévi-Strauss, in that essay, explained the inevitable relationship between language and culture. And it tries to dispel the claim of linguists that their structural linguistics had nothing to do with culture. So he dispelled this claim of the linguists that their structural linguistics had nothing to do with culture, social life, and history of the speakers of a language. He dispelled this idea. He concluded the essay by challenging both the linguists as well as the anthropologists to work together closely and discover together correlations that exist between language and culture on certain issues and on certain levels. So Lévi-Strauss or Claude Lévi-Strauss demonstrated what the proposed marriage between linguistics and anthropology could achieve by combining Saussure's analysis of language with Jacobson's phonemic analysis. So combining these two to show the likeness between kinship systems and language. Similarly, Claude Lévi-Strauss applied Lang and Parole in his effort to prove that languages and myths of different cultures resembled each other and appeared to be structured in a similar fashion. Lévi-Strauss advocated the application of the Saussurian theory of language to cultural phenomena with full awareness of its possible limitations. So, in his study of myth, Claude Lévi-Strauss, in his study of myth, he had to address the dimension of time which characterizes the telling of myths but is absent in Saussurian theory of language. So he decided, Claude Lévi-Strauss decided to distinguish Lang and Parole of myths by different time dimensions of each other. And to account for the shift in time, he added to the Saussurian duo, that is Lang and Parole, a third dimension. And what is that third dimension? Quote unquote, the gross constituent unit. So this third dimension, the gross constituent unit, was added by Claude Lévi-Strauss in the Saussurian duo of Lang and Parole in order to distinguish the dimensions. So Lévi-Strauss, however, his work, I mean the works of Claude Levi-Strauss was also not spared from criticism. He was also criticized. It has been criticized for presenting a society that ignores the role of power, and a culture that has no influence of active human intervention. So, for this, he was criticized. Other critics also find Levi Strauss's structuralism guilty of transforming men into aesthetic, timeless objects. Yes, critics of Claude Levi-Strauss criticizes him for his structuralism and finds him and his structuralism guilty of transforming men into aesthetic, timeless objects related to things in the world and to other men in purely formal, objective, and timeless ways. So, still more, he was also criticized for misunderstanding some linguistic concepts despite his faithfulness to Saussurean terminologies. Nevertheless, dear friends, within cultural studies, the works of Claude Levi-Strauss and his structuralism is regarded as a cornerstone in the application of structural and linguistic analogies to the analysis of cultural phenomena. So, by focusing on universal patterns of opposition to explain social reality, he, that is Claude Levi-Strauss, elaborated that cultural systems are rule governed, just as language is a rule governed activity. Similarly, Claude Levi-Strauss, by focusing on universal patterns of oppositions, tried to establish that cultural systems are also rule governed. And I quote Claude Levi-Strauss here, it's a long quote, I present it before you. In asserting that cultures have developed not simply in response to external demands, but more fundamentally in accordance with the human mind's internal constraints, Levi-Strauss took a major step away from empiricism at a time when empiricism exercised an almost total domination over the social and psychological sciences. I'm sorry, it was not a quote. In asserting, my dear friends, that cultures have developed not simply in response to external demands, but more fundamentally in accordance with the human mind's internal constraints, Strauss looked a major step away from empiricism. And he was doing it, he was looking away from empiricism at a time when empiricism exercised an almost total domination over the social and psychological sciences. So eventually, my dear friends, his theory of unconscious structures did lead to the creation of various new subjects of inquiry, such as the relationship between the structures of all sign in language, their function within messages, and their rapport with other sign systems such as music, gestures, and body language. So, my dear friends, linguistics further influenced cultural studies through another linguist, through another philosopher, Roland Barthes. So we are now coming to Roland Barthes. Friends, just like Claude Levi-Strauss, Roland Barthes was also indebted to Saussure. In his both apparent and professed way. However, Barth made a more personal and a radical reading of Saussure in comparison to Claude Lévi-Strauss. So Barth argued that any science system operates on two planes, the plane of experience and the plane of analysis. So on the plane of experience, that is the experiential plane, the signifier and the signified are so inseparable from each other that people only see one thing. And what is that one thing? The sign, S-I-G-N. So on the plane of experience, the experiential plane, the signifier and the signified are so inseparable from each other that people can only see one thing, and that is the sign. For example, in the Western view, although a bunch of roses signifies passion, that people tend to ignore the signifier, the roses. They are knowing the passion, they are more concerned about the passion, but the signifier is ignored, the roses. And the signified passion, and consequently only see the sign, personified roses. So the signifier, roses, and the signified, passion, both are consequently lost, and people can only see the sign. And what is the sign? Passionified roses. So on the plane of analysis, the signifier, which is the conceptual rose, the signified, which is passion, and the sign, which is the actual rose, are treated as separate items. So Barth contended that the plane of analysis provides a comprehensive understanding of how the process of representation articulates meaning, because it provides two semiological systems. What are the two semiological systems? On one hand, that is Roland Barthes, saw a system of signification that articulates the literal meaning of signs. He called this system the language object, and the resulted meaning thereof produced denotation. On the other hand, he saw another signification system that is created when this denotative meaning is turned into a signifier of a subsequent semiological system. And he termed this second order semiological system as myth, and its meaning is termed by Roland Barthes as connotation, or what you can say, the connotative meaning. So Barthes, my dear friend, used images such as photographs, paintings, drawings, images from theater, images from cinema, in order to illustrate how denotative and connotative meanings operate. So at first sight, each of these images is a message without a code, and the reader sees it as having an analogical relation to its object. However, the way the same representation is treated in a particular culture, in a particular cultural context, it produces another level of meaning. So thus, denotation is the literal meaning of an image, you know this, while connotation is the manner in which society communicates what it thinks of that image. So, thus, myth is the imposition of a second meaning on an image. More importantly, my dear friends, Roland Barthes saw myth as a peculiar system because the process of imposing meaning on an image reduces the material of mythical speech. For example, ordinary language, photography, and rituals to a pure signifying function. So, friends, Barth's conception of denotation and connotation led him to perceive myth not as an object but as a meta language. Barth's conception of denotation and connotation led him to perceive myth not as an object but as a meta language. So he concludes that meaning is produced meaning is produced either linguistically and mythically. So this is what Barth says, that there are two ways of creating meaning, producing meaning. So either the meaning is produced linguistically or mythically. A situation that gives an ambiguous identity to the signifier. So on the one hand, the signifier is the final term of the linguistic system, and on the other hand, the signifier is the first term of the mythical system. Barth believed that this dual process of meaning production affects the way semiology interrogates semiology interrogates any system of signification. So Barth says, and I quote, no, it's not Barth. Barth says that when Barth reflects on meta language, the semiologist no longer needs to ask himself questions about the composition of the language object. He no longer has to take into account the details of the linguistic schema, schema. He will only need to know its total term or logical sign, and only in as much as his terms lend itself to myth. So to avoid causing confusion, Roland Barthes used the terms meaning and form to describe the final term of the linguistic system and the first term of the mythical system respectively. Furthermore, he simplified his description by employing the analogy of fullness and emptiness to illustrate how the ambiguous signifier operates within each of the two systems. So Barth further argued that on both the linguistic plane and the mythical plane, the signified is a concept. However, unlike the form, it is not abstract. It is filled with a situation that allows for a new history to be implanted in the myth. So in other words, the concept is determined. It is at once historical and intentional. It is the motivation which causes the myth to be uttered. So as described earlier, my dear friends, the tendency of the concept supports the claim that meaning is constructed. When the relationship between the signifier and the signified draws from things, people, events, etc., outside the semiological chain, so it becomes clear that meaning is constructed. So thus, this observation caused Barth to point out that the mythical concept is not a purified essence of reality, but rather some appropriated aspect of that reality. The claim is strengthened by the fact that one concept may be articulated by more than one signifier. One concept can be articulated by more than one signifier. So Barth used the term signification to refer to the new sign that develops on the plane of myth. He rationalizes that the term is appropriate because it emphasizes the double function of myth. The double function of what you can say myth. So once again he stressed the fact that meaning is a social construct by observing that the process of signification naturally distorts meaning because the concept and meaning of myth are always in a relation of deformation. The concept distorts the meaning, correct, but it does not abolish it, because a linguistic meaning is already constitutes the form of the myth. So Barth further stressed the social construction of meaning, while he observed that the mythical signification is never arbitrary. It is always in part motivated and unavoidably contains some analogy. So it is never arbitrary. It is always in part motivated and unavoidably contains some analogy or analogy. Barth's observation that motivation is chosen among other possible options provided further support to his claim that meaning is socially constructed. So now let us talk about a major weakness in this theory of Barth. So a major weakness of Barth's conceptualization of sign systems, although, is seen in his preoccupation with how society constructs meaning at the expense of the role of the reader in decoding the constructed meaning. So by arguing that myth works through common sense, Barth treated cultural meanings as a given currency which is shared by everyone who is at all acculturated to contemporary popular culture. So thus he unnecessarily privileged the author's preferred meaning, thereby misrepresenting the reader of a given text as a cultural dupe. So for example, his entire 1951-57 seminal essay, Myth Today, it was titled as Myth Today, perhaps if I'm not wrong. So this seminal essay by Roland Barthes, Myth Today, written in 1957, is not only silent about how the audience reads mythical speech, but it also uses a tone that presupposes that all readers are ideological victims of myth. So Barthes' conception of sign systems nevertheless offered cultural theorists a versatile model for comprehending how the process of representation produces meaning. The first and the foremost, unlike Saussure, who pursued a dyadic model of sign, Barthes pursued a triadic model such a sign has an interior relation which unites the signifier to its signifier. Then two exterior relations, a virtual one, that unless the sign to a specific reservoir of other signs, it may be drawn from in order to be interested in discourse, and an actual one that unites the sign to other signs in the discourse preceding or succeeding it. The triadic model served Roland Barthes well by enabling him to attach, what you can say, significant importance to contextual issues of signification. Apparently, he was skeptical about the realism of the text. So, rather than treating realism as a consequence of discourse, namely reflecting the world, Roland Barthes asked the reader to consider realism as an artful assemblage of language that creates the effect of naive representation. So Barthes' work represented the first serious initiative to combine the study of signifying systems with critical theory. This provided, my dear friends, a much needed infusion of new conceptual blood into the new, or rather the neo-Marxist cultural theory, much of which was still lumbering along under the impetus of concepts from Marx's century-old economic and philosophical manuscripts. So what Barthes was doing is that he was trying to give a kind of a neo-Marxist theories with the help of this myth concept and all. Furthermore, my dear friends, through the work of Barthes, the study of popular culture was legitimized. While his contemporaries like Lévi-Strauss and Lacan worked with esoteric materials, it was Barthes who showed that junk culture could also be subjected to intellectual analysis. So by the 1970s, the works of Roland Barthes profoundly informed the intellectual character of British cultural studies in the areas such as advertising and news. And by the 1980s, his work had become almost canonical in the areas of cultural studies. So central, now we are coming to Stuart Hall. And this is going to be the last phase of our discussion. So central to the agenda of British cultural studies was the question how messages are produced and consumed in the mass media. And Barthes' conceptualization of the signifier and the signifier and the concept of denotation and connotation proved very influential in this regard. In contemporary times, the influence of linguistics on British cultural studies has found expression in the work of Stuart Hall. Friends, Stuart Hall employed the terms denotation and connotation in his theory of encoding and decoding, which he developed in reaction to the traditional American model of communication. Stuart Hall thought that the American model of communication was too linear and too simplified to explain the complex process of communication. So instead, he proposed a four-stage model with linked but distinct moments. And what is that four-stage model? Number one, production. Number two, circulation. Number three, distribution consumption. And number four, reproduction. So, in his understanding of these four stages, he says that these four stages, Stuart Hall says that these four stages represent a complex structure of dominance sustained through articulation of connected practices, each of which, however, retain its distinctiveness and has its own specific modality in its forms and conditions of existence. Stuart Hall, my dear friends, contends that the media messages are produced and consumed the way media messages, the way media messages are produced and consumed is overdetermined by a range of influence. For example, television and newspaper messages would be different from each other in terms of their discourses, the pictorial conventions, and the technologies used to carry the message. So, in the footsteps of Roland Barthes, Hall believes that there is nothing natural about any kind of communication because messages must be constructed before they are sent. So, since messages are constructed before they are being sent, hence, according to Stuart Hall, in the line of Roland Barthes, there is nothing natural about communication. So, all communication is basically structured, all communication is basically planned, all communication is basically constructed, and what I always say to you that all communication is not innocent. So Hall does not only link this unnaturalness of messages to Barthes's concept of denotation and connotation, but he also takes it a step further by arguing that all messages are coded and become inevitably connotative. Since Stuart Hall says that since all messages are actually coded, so there is an encoding system working in all messages. So since all messages are coded, hence they become inevitably connotative. So Hall clarifies his position by presenting codes that operate at two closely related levels. At the first level are widely distributed codes which are learned at very early stages within a community or culture, hence they appear natural. Look here what he says. He says that at the first level there are widely distributed codes which are learned at very early stages within a community or culture, hence they appear natural. At the second level are those unnatural codes that become naturalized and are not widely distributed in society. So they are particular, they are specific. In essence, the practice of coding can only be said to be more comprehensive if the code in question appears to be more natural. If the code in question appears to be more natural, so in essence, the practice of coding can only be said to be more comprehensive. The common eye usually thinks the naturalized codes give us literal meanings. Yet, the fact of the matter is that the critical eye sees in them an ideology. Look here. The uncritical eye, the common eye, thinks that the naturalized codes are given to us and hence they have a literal meaning. So we take the things at their face value, we take the things very literally. But a critical eye is able to look into the connotative side, the constructed side aspect of that code, and can that critical eye can see the ideology inside it. So, as far as Hall is concerned, therefore, the distinction between the denotative meaning and the connotative meaning is simply an analytic one. In real life, it is very unlikely that one would find a sign that is purely denotative, because usually they combine the two meanings. So even the naturalized code is laden with extra meanings. Even the naturalized codes are also laden with extra meanings. And when you think about the denotative meaning of a word, you can also see a lot of connotative meaning inside it. So the distinction is useful in analysis. To be able to apply a rough rule of thumb which distinguishes those aspects of a sign which appear to be taken in any language community at any point in time as its what you can say literal meaning, that is denotation, from the more associative meaning for a sign which is possible to generate, that is the connotation. So Hall, unlike Roland Barthes, does not take for granted the role of the readers in his theorization of the process of meaning production. So the theory of Hall, the theory of in encoding and decoding. Hall's theory of encoding and decoding recognizes three types of readers. The first one is the dominant reader, who is cheated by the author's subtle use of codes. That reader, for instance, takes the television text for granted and understands it in terms of nothing but its denotative meaning. The codes have been naturalized for him or her. Then there is the negotiated reader, who accepts some part of the dominant reading but rejects to take the rest because it does not suit his needs. He stands between the denotative and the connotative meaning. And finally, there is the oppositional reader, who is aware of the dominant code, the connotative meaning, which structure the message. Hence, he rejects it completely. Friends, let us now conclude today's discussion by saying that Hall's theory of encoding and decoding is one of the most influential theories within cultural studies because of its tendency to give the audience a sense of agency in their interaction with dominant ideology. So although the parameters of cultural studies continue to be fragile, the influence of linguistics on the multidisciplinary field of cultural studies is clearly articulated in both apparent and professed manner. The work of, my dear friends, the work of Ferdinand de Saussure directly influenced the work of Claude Lévi-Strauss and Roland Barthes. Stuart Hall, although does not use Saussurean concepts directly, but he indirectly benefits from Saussure's work through the influence that he receives from Roland Barthes. However, in the post-linguistic turn era, cultural studies is apparently now disinterested in current linguistic theorizings, more particularly the theorizings of generative linguistics. And this is, as such, I see it as a bad thing, because this is basically hindering the way of the development of cultural studies. So the discipline, cultural studies as a discipline at present is stuck in a structuralism. Although every other well-defined discipline within the human sciences has felt the tag of generative linguistics, cultural studies is not as such very much influenced and touched by generative linguistics. So let us stop here. That's all for today. In our next lecture, we will be specifically talking about structuralism and its use in cultural studies. So thank you very much for today. Thank you.